So, good morning. This is a presentation of the Center for Future Consciousness, and I'm Tom Lombardo. And any graphics in the presentation today are mostly done by Terry Spataro, who's also the coordinator for the webinars. And the webinar today, which is webinar 12, is the Cosmology, Ecology, and Biology of Consciousness. This webinar is part of my series, The Future Evolution of Consciousness. And today I'm going to be tackling this mammoth topic on cosmology, ecology, and biology as they pertain to understanding consciousness. Now, all of the webinars in this series have corresponding chapters which have been written and are available up on my website. And I have up here the book reference. The book reference is also in the outline. So if you want to go look at all the chapters that have been done so far, you could simply look on the outline, the PDF outline, find the URL, and go to that link that's up there. The chapter for today is already up there as well. It's part three of an ecological evolutionary theory of consciousness, dealing with cosmology, ecology, and biology. But that chapter is up there as well. And also, in case you don't know, all of the webinars, the videos of them are up on my YouTube channel, and the YouTube link is also in the outline. And Terry's pretty quick about doing the recordings. So the recording for the webinar today should be up fairly soon up on the YouTube channel as well. But you can see all the previous webinars up on the YouTube channel so far. And there's at least 11. I may have do an A and B. There may be even more than 11 up there already. Now, something I should apologize for, which is that normally I have pretty graphics that go along with the webinars. The content of this webinar was so rich and deep that I never got around to doing any pretty graphics. So the slides are going to be basically just text. And normally what I do right at the beginning of a webinar is I do a quick review of the previous webinar. And the previous webinar I did was on emotion and motivation. And I talked about the nature of feelings, the experience of feelings, and its relevance to the hard problem of consciousness. I talked about the connection between emotion and motivation and cognition, even though we normally distinguish between cognition or cognitive processes and emotional processes. The two are interwoven together. I talked about the gestalt of emotion, which involves thinking and feeling and bodily reactions, etc. I got into talking about evolutionary perspectives on emotion. Do animals have emotion? I discussed the very prevalent theory of emotions, the wheel models of emotion, that emotions come in oppositional pairs, which can be diagrammed on wheels. I talked about the significance of pleasure and pain when it comes to understanding emotion and motivation. I talked about voluntary control of emotions, and I talked about the connection between motivation, desire, and purpose, how motivation involves desire and purpose. I discussed all the facets of motivation and examples of different characteristic human motives, and talked about some different theoretical issues regarding understanding human motivation, like Maslow's theory of motivation and social cultural perspectives and the idea that there's some master motives. And then I talked about the future on the evolutionary nature of emotion and motivation. So that's a very quick review. If you want to look at the whole video is up there, as well as the chapter corresponding to an understanding of emotion and motivation, which I see both as critical, essential features of primordial consciousness. Now, today, and here's an outline for today, I'm going to talk about basically physical aspects of the universe that are relevant to understanding consciousness, beginning at a cosmic level. What is there about the universe as a whole that's relevant to consciousness? What is there about cosmic evolution in the physical universe? What about the topic of physical open systems and the manifestation of energy through the universe? How is that relevant? What about the structure of that energy in the universe? How is that relevant to consciousness? How do the phenomena of subjectivity and objectivity as conscious phenomena connect with the physical dimensions of consciousness? Then I'm going to move into ecology. And are there certain conditions of ecologies that are relevant to consciousness? And then I'm going to move into a discussion of life, the biology of life, and how that is relevant to understanding consciousness. And I'm going to talk about ecological biological systems and localization and holism in the nervous system and the brain and the body. Then I'm going to compare two different theories of the way the nervous system and the brain is organized, an input-output theory and a loop theory. And then I'm going to discuss the issue which comes up quite frequently. What's the connection between consciousness and the physical brain? And I'm going to provide an alternative to standard ways of thinking about the relationship of our body and our consciousness and present an ecological relational theory of consciousness. And then at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit, and there's a lot more to be said, on the question of can physical machines, AIs, robots, computers, can they realize consciousness? Why or why not do we think that? And then there'll be some concluding remarks at the end. So that's a basic outline. Now, normally when I do presentations and I put up text, I will highlight certain key words or concepts with in yellow to distinguish and highlight them out from the text. But I was thinking that the fundamental theme of this webinar is to propose to you that there are certain necessary physical conditions for consciousness, necessary. And as I was thinking the whole process through, I came up with a number of proposals and reasons for those proposals as to why I think the following physical conditions are necessary for the realization of consciousness. And those, what I identify as necessary physical conditions of consciousness, I have highlighted in pink or magenta to really stand out. So as you look at the slides as they come up and listen to me, note the terms that are highlighted, particularly in pink, because those I'm proposing to you are necessary physical conditions of consciousness. Now, So that you don't end up thinking that I'm a materialist or a physicalist, I'm going to start off with a basic introductory point. I'm going to be shifting from a phenomenological description of consciousness to a physical description of the conditions of consciousness. Are there certain basic physical conditions necessary? I'm going to propose a whole set of necessary physical conditions for consciousness, and by implication, argue that the notion of disembodied consciousness is a false, impossible idea. In that sense, I'm a physicalist. I do not believe in disembodied consciousness. I think consciousness requires physicality. I'm going to frame this whole thing in terms of my ecological evolutionary perspective on physical reality. That is, the general theory I'm adopting is that physical reality is an ecological and evolutionary reality. It both is a set of ecological interconnections and it's all evolving. So I have that general theory of physicality underlying all of this. If you remember when I talked about theories of consciousness, the contemporary philosopher Thomas Nagel had, in his book Mind and Cosmos, had argued that there appear to be two alternative perspectives, fundamental perspectives we can take on reality. One of them being a phenomenological perspective emphasizing consciousness, the other being a physical perspective on our reality that we see around us. And Nagel's argument was that these two alternative perspectives are equally fundamental and you can't reduce one to the other. And in order to understand the holistic nature of reality, we have to find a way to mesh the two together without reducing or assimilating one into the other. Around this, what we observe is physicality, a third person objective perspective. What we observe from our own personal perspective is the pervasiveness of our consciousness. And in Nagel's mind, these two perspectives are equally valid. And so that you see why I'm not a materialist, I will suggest to you that um, our descriptions of the physical conditions of consciousness are a result of our conscious investigation of the physical world and are revealed through the medium of consciousness. So, what we call the physical world is revealed to us and understood by us through consciousness. The reciprocal, though, is also equally true, that various physical conditions, such as in the body and the brain, seem to be clearly involved, if not necessary, for the manifestation of consciousness. So the reciprocity there, very simply, is that although it appears that the physical world is a necessary condition for consciousness, our understanding of that physical world is revealed through consciousness. So we go around in a loop. And that's the mindset that I'm adopting here. So even though I'm going to be talking about a lot of different physical conditions about consciousness, keep in mind that I realize that these physical conditions that I'm going to be talking about, we understand them and apprehend them and encounter them through the medium of our consciousness. So we have a loop. So let's begin with the cosmic ontology of consciousness. And this is an argument that I presented right at the beginning of the webinar series. In order to understand consciousness, we must understand the fundamental nature of our cosmos, of our universe, because consciousness exists and is expressive of this fundamental cosmic nature or cosmic reality. That is, consciousness exists in the cosmos, and so in order to understand consciousness, we have to frame it within the context of that very cosmos. Now, there's been multiple theories presented as to fundamental ontologies of the cosmos that provide a basis for understanding consciousness. We have materialism, idealism, dualism, panpsychism. I talked about all of these under theories of consciousness. These are theories of ultimate reality, including primal source theories that there's some fundamental ultimate reality, and that ultimate reality is going to help us to understand how we get consciousness. In fact, sometimes the ultimate fundamental reality that people propose is consciousness itself. Now, what I'm going to suggest is that the fundamental reality of the cosmos, as revealed through our scientific understanding of the cosmos, in incredible depth and detail, with an immense amount of evidence to support the view, is that we live in a evolutionary, ecological, physical cosmos that is fundamental to the nature of the cosmos. And the evidence for that is immense. Without going into the details of it, I've talked about this a lot in chapters 1 through 3, but this is by far the most deeply, pervasively, intricately supported view of the nature of our universe, much more so than any other theory, any other perspective that humanity has ever developed. And I'm going to start, as I mentioned a little earlier, from that perspective. From that perspective on the physical universe and the cosmos as a whole, it clearly appears that the complexity in our universe has evolved. And it has evolved through a series of increasingly more complex levels of entities and patterns of interaction. The most ancient realities, the most primordial realities, are the simplest. And as we move up to higher levels of complexity, we get increasingly more intricate and unique realities. And so reality is a hierarchical plethora of different types of entities and processes that have evolved in a series of stages back to the most simplest stages of all. And so I'm going to suggest to you that since this evolutionary pattern to the universe is the most ubiquitous and fundamental feature of the universe, that if consciousness is embodied in this physical cosmos, then consciousness requires, as a first necessary physical condition, an evolutionary physical universe. That consciousness could not emerge or manifest itself except within a evolving physical universe, because consciousness is a complex, non-simple phenomena that requires physical complexity, and the physical complexity of the universe, as deeply revealed through science, is due to evolution. So consciousness requires an evolutionary physical universe. And I have other arguments that I have in the chapter, but as a fundamental one, consciousness is complex, requires complexity in the physical universe, and that complexity in the physical universe emerged through evolution. It wasn't a given. But secondly, as a second necessary condition, even though we tend to think of evolution as a process of transformation, evolution is actually a synthesis and combination of stability and change, where each level provides certain stable features upon which the next level evolves. And in every level, where we find our relatively persistent entities, which do undergo transformation, but it's always a combination of stability and transformation. And so I'm going to list as a second fundamental cosmic condition a combination of stability and change in the physical universe. And the two things are equally necessary for the emergence of consciousness. Now, even though we can describe the evolution of complexity as a hierarchical pattern of more simple parts combining into more complex parts, combining more complex wholes, combining into more complex wholes. The reciprocal complementary description, which is equally true and connected with the first one, is that complexity emerges by increasingly more complex differentiations forming in the ambience of the cosmos. Now, what I mean by that is that any complex entity that we observe in the cosmos, physical entity, is actually a differentiation relative to its surround. So the body is a differentiation relative to what's around it. A star is a differentiation relative to its outer spatial conditions. A cell is a differentiation relative to other cells. That is, all of the hierarchical combinations that keep forming are actually more intricate and intricate differentiations of that entity relative to its surround. Now, notice what we have here is we have a combination of two complementary processes: to integrate and to differentiate. And both things occur simultaneously in the evolution of the universe. So if we look at entities within our physical universe, what we find is we find these localized, differentiated, complex entities. The body is a relatively localized, internally differentiated, externally differentiated, complex entity. And I'm going to suggest that this is another necessary physical condition for consciousness. That these differentiated, multiple level hierarchical structures have emerged in local regions of the cosmos. And insofar as they emerge, around them are going to be an ambience of other differentiated complex entities. So, as a second and corollary, as not a second, it's actually a fourth, necessary condition of consciousness, physical condition. Not only do we have localized differentiated complex entities, these localized differentiated complex entities exist in an ambience of other differentiated localized complex entities. That is, we have this pluralism of localized complexities which are differentiated from each other and are built up out of parts coming into wholes, coming into greater wholes, coming into greater wholes. Now, notice that I'm not including just the entities which realize consciousness, I'm including the very ambience or ecology in which those entities emerge. And they emerge within an ambience of other differentiated complex entities. And I'm taking all of that as necessary for consciousness. Now, if you recall, I had talked about the idea that the universe fundamentally can be described as dynamic, interactive, open systems, where the entities in the universe are both affected by and affect surrounding entities. That is, open system entities, of which that consists of most of the universe, if not all of it, all interact with their surroundings. That is, all open systems are surrounded by or engulfed by within an ambience of other open system entities which they interact. And all of these open system entities are internally dynamic, where their parts, their constituents, are in a continual state of dynamical interaction with each other. And open systems, by their very nature, require the inflow of energy to maintain their differentiated individuality and structure, and they all generate outflow. They're open in both directions in terms of incoming energy and material into them and outflowing energy and effects coming out of them. And both of those processes make up what we mean by the system being open. And both of those processes are integral to the open system being able to maintain its complex differentiation within the universe. That is, the individual can only maintain its individuality as an open system by being interacted with what's around it. So, as another necessary set of physical conditions of consciousness, I would say number one, entities in the universe, which are open systems, require that they are affected by their surroundings. They can't be isolated from their surroundings. They have to be affected by it. Secondly, they have to be internally dynamic as opposed to inert. That is, consciousness cannot ride on a sea of tranquility, nor can it exist in a sea of uniformity. Internally, physical entities which are conscious are dynamic, they're not tranquil, and they exist in interactive surrounds of differentiated entities as opposed to a sea of uniformity. So, open systems as conscious entities are affected by external systems through the modification of their internal processes. So, their dynamic processes inside are affected by impact from the outside. But the converse is going to be true also, is that open system entities, physical entities, which are conscious, have to have the capacity to impact their surroundings. So not only are they being affected by the surroundings, but they affect those surroundings itself. So what do we have so far? We have a universe of open systems, which are complex, hierarchical, dynamic entities, which both affect and are affected by other complex entities within their cosmic ambience. Now, insofar as open systems in the universe all generate extremely complex patterns of energy, those patterns of energy off of open systems permeate out into the universe. In fact, the entities in the universe, which are open systems, through patterns of energy off of them, manifest the reality through propagated patterns of energy into the surround. Now, when we think about an entity in the universe, say a star, a planet, an asteroid, or more locally, an animal, whatever, a mountain, we think, well, there's that entity localized in space. That is its nature. But because all the entities in the universe pretty much are open systems, they are all manifesting their nature to the outside through the structured patterns of energy that emanate and reflect off of their own differentiated nature. That is, everything is propagating its presence out into that universe through patterns of energy off of it. So the universe is a collective openness of entities. And these entities are through differential energetic effects manifesting their very nature out into their surround. And I'm going to list that as another critical physical condition of consciousness. That is, that the entities in the universe are manifesting their presence and their nature to their surround, which are other entities, through the differential energy effects they are generating out into the universe. And so they're manifesting their reality out into the universe. Now, just to stop for a second so that I make sure I highlight something here. When people talk about the physical conditions of consciousness, they usually will end up focusing on the biological body or the physical brain, totally missing the fundamental fact that those physical entities are situated, embedded within a very complex physical ambience that is the entire universe. So even though it might seem strange, what I'm trying to present to you here is the idea that in order to understand the physical conditions of consciousness, one has to start at the cosmic level, at a more pervasive, fundamental level than just simply a biological body or a biological brain, because that's only one little narrow piece of the physicality of consciousness. It's the entire universe and the way it's put together and in its evolution that has created the physical conditions of consciousness in some fundamental ways. Now, every location in the universe is therefore surrounded by a differentiated and convergent ambient array of energy that's patterned and structured and deterministically specific to the surrounding entities. So, no matter where you are in the universe at any location, you are surrounded by an energetic array, a pattern of energy, which is manifesting to you the nature and presence of all the other entities in the universe, wherever you happen to be standing. We all exist as physical entities in a structured energetic ambience. And this lines up with Gibson, who I talked about earlier, that the stimulus energy impinging upon a living organism contains information about the surrounding environment because it's specifically determined and structured by that surrounding environment. So, as a basic physical condition of consciousness, we need relatively localized open systems, and it is localized open systems which particularly evolve complexity, that are differentially impacted, they're affected by an energetically structured ambience around them that reflects and manifests the nature and makeup of surrounding open systems. Notice this is an ecological gestalt that we exist in. And open system life forms on the earth satisfy those conditions. Now, life forms other places may satisfy those conditions too, but life forms on the earth definitely do. They're open systems, they're relatively localized, they are differentially impacted by a structured energetic array surrounding them, which manifests the nature of other entities to it. Now, also, I want to point out that another necessary feature, physical condition of consciousness, is that the physical entity, which is conscious, has an array of structured energetic patterns that it is generating in itself, reflective of its internal states, the configuration of its body. That is, the conscious physical entity has dynamic internal states and configurations which are producing energetic patterns within it. So, as another physical condition of consciousness, a system must energetically be open to its own internal states and impacted from them. So the system has to be open to itself. So, in order for a physical system to be conscious, that physical system has to be reactive to particular patterns of energy and configurations of its own physical makeup. And this will become the foundation for it having self-awareness, to jump ahead a step. So we have a energetic array, structured array, that is impacting an open system that's reflective of the surrounding conditions of that open system, as well as the internal conditions of its own physical dynamic makeup. And those physical conditions I just described are the foundation for two of the primordial forms of consciousness: perceptual awareness of the external world and proprioceptual awareness of one's own body. And in fact, even more so, information about the relationship between the two, between myself and the world out there. Now, one thing about the energetic manifestation, structured manifestation of the universe to itself, is that at each location, the structured manifestation is going to be relativistic. It's going to be from a perspective. So the convergent energy to me is from a particular perspective due to the fact that I'm localized in a particular spot in space. I don't get a non-relativistic manifestation of the universe. I get a perspectival manifestation of the universe to me. And so does any other living creature who is localized in space and time. Now, you can broaden your perspectives by moving about through space, but you can't break free of the fact that no matter how you are observing the universe, being within it and being localized, you're always going to be grounded in a relativistic as opposed to non-relativistic foundation. In fact, I would suggest that the idea of a non-relativistic apprehension of the totality of the universe is nonsensical because anything which is conscious is a localized open system within the universe, and it has to be someplace in it that is localized and therefore relative. So the notion of non-relational or non-relative or absolute consciousness is ridiculous because the only way one can be conscious is by being within it and being localized physically within it. So it always comes out relative, no matter how many different perspectives you take. Now, the more perspectives you take, the better, the less relativistic it becomes, but it always stays relativistic because you're only sampling points of view within the system. So our consciousness, I would suggest, is experienced as contained within this ambient, structured, energetic universe that engulfs our biological bodies. And so we feel as our consciousness being within the universe. So all kinds of observation at the sensory perceptual level is physically relativistic. That is, it is subjective. You could expand to become more progressively objective by taking more points of view, but you can never realize absolute objectivity because all your sensory perceptual perspectives are going to be subjective. So you're just simply expanding your subjectivity as you become more objective, so to speak. So the objective subjective distinction is relative, it's on a continuum. So the distinction that Nagel brings up between the physical perspective as objective, third person, and the consciousness perspective as subjective, first person, is actually a relative as opposed to an absolute distinction. Subjective can also mean one's inner state of being. But I should point out that the distinction between inner and outer and I and the other, they're also relative as well too, even extrinsic versus extrinsic. So open systems realize their distinctive intrinsic identities, but relative to differentiating themselves from their surround. So our distinctive identity physically, and I would suggest when we get to it consciously, is relational rather than absolute. So when we say our subjectivity, our sense of our inner reality, that is in distinction to our outer reality as through perceptual consciousness. And our subjective inner sense of being, as I brought up earlier, and I'll just come back to it again, is grounded in sensitivity to our localized body. So my conscious sense of an I is grounded in my proprioceptive consciousness of my body, but that's always relative to my perceptual consciousness of what surrounds me and isn't me. So the I other is a relative reciprocal distinction, and my inner sense is experienced, grounded in my proprioceptual sense of my body, but embedded in relationship to the outside. So there is no I or me without the other. There is no subjective without a a outer or other reality from which I have distinguished myself but relate myself to. Now let's move on to ecology. And I've already started introducing this, but I'm going to get a little more specific about the concept of ecology. A definition of ecology is a scientific study of how living organisms, biotic, interact with each other and with their non-living physical surroundings, abiotic. And the term is actually derived, excuse me, excuse me, from the Greek word oikos, meaning house, and logi, meaning study of. So ecology literally means the study of our house. Now, when I use the word ecology, I'm going to use it to refer to the house itself. So I'm going to make a distinction between ecological reality and the science of ecology, which studies that ecological reality. Now, it's clear that consciousness exists in our earthly ecology. We're conscious. Looks like a lot of other animals are conscious. We exist in this earthly ecology, so I take that as as a given. Are there certain significant conditions of our earthly ecology which are essential to consciousness? But I could even broaden that out a bit and I could say, are there some general conditions, physical conditions for any type of planetary ecology that are essential to consciousness? And as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, science fiction has repeatedly got into the question of what are the kinds of planetary conditions could support the emergence of conscious life forms besides what we see on the Earth. And I think you can make a decent case that there are certain general conditions which earthly ecology satisfies that other ecologies might satisfy too, whereby conscious creatures could evolve on other planetary systems besides the Earth. But it seems like there are certain fundamental conditions that need to be met. And from what I've already said, um, what we need to find, or not find, we need to identify are those types of distinctive, collectively determined interactive conditions of populations of interactive entities that are associated with the emergence of consciousness. What types of interactive physical ecologies support consciousness? Now, all the open system entities in the cosmos, they exist in relatively localized, distinctive surrounding ecologies. For example, planets exist in solar system ecologies and are interactive with the other planets and the stars and the asteroids and meteors, etc., and comets of those ecologies. Solar systems exist in galactic ecologies. And so our sun and the planets is affected by all the other stars and the general patterns of motion in the galaxy as a whole. And the open system entities on a planet exist within a planetary ecology. So the term ecology has a broad meaning to mean simply an area that involves a set of interactive entities that um, are mutually supportive of each other's existence and require each other and have an effect upon each other. Um, so, first, I would say that consciousness arises in complex open system entities which are interactive, forming some kind of a physical plurality among themselves. That is, consciousness cannot arise in a single relatively isolated entity. That is, you can't have one conscious being existing in a surround that doesn't contain within it any other complex entities with which it interacts. That is, consciousness emerges in collective realities. In fact, the individual complexity of physical entities requires surrounding complex entities in order for it to emerge. And an idea that has been tossed around quite a bit, given the conditions of living forms in the ecology on the earth, is this assumption that perhaps consciousness does require life as a physical precondition, uh, in that life satisfies at least the set of physical conditions I've described so far. And I'm going to go with that idea as I explore in depth a little more the ecology of consciousness. That the ecology of consciousness involves the notion that living forms need to come into this ecology in order for us to have consciousness. Now, one key thing about our earthly ecology is that it involves this interactive and interpenetrating um, relationship between life and the inorganic, and that our Earth, as a total interactive, interpenetrating system, has evolved over time and possesses this meshing together of what we would call life and non-life. But it also contains certain relatively stable conditions in it. But these ecologies are also on the Earth collectively very dynamic. And in fact, in no sense whatsoever can you say that the ecology of the earth has been stable or harmonious through its history. In fact, there's a general hypothesis which has been presented over and over again, is that it looks as if the complexity of life on the earth and the evolution of consciousness in hominids and humans and indices from life forms has been instigated and provoked by significant ecological environmental transformations. So it doesn't look as if conscious life forms on the earth would have evolved or emerged except within a evolutionary ecology that involved significant repeated fundamental changes and transformations in it, which provoked the evolution of life and consciousness. And the argument could be made that conscious life forms actually may require other conscious life forms in order to exist. So just like life may be an interactive process, consciousness may be an interactive process too, or supported by an interactive process. So the consciousness in any individual life form requires an ecological context of other conscious physical life forms as well. So again, it's not something that just happens one spot. It's something that happens collectively, where it's a mutual amplification among many interactive conscious life forms. Now, I'm going to mention just briefly, and by the way, there's lots of stuff in every one of these topics that I'm leaving out because of just trying to highlight certain themes and not other ones. Um, One general feature of the interactive reality of conscious open systems on the Earth is the ecological loop, which I've talked about already, of affordances and effectivities. the physical ecological underpinnings of conscious perception and proprioception and behavior and emotion and motivation are tied up with these two fundamental physical processes to um, by means of which we um, are conscious of the world, engage the world, feel the world, and desire the world. The affordances of the environment are those features of the environment that life forms are in, which are meaningful and necessary for the perpetuation of the way of life of that life form. That is, the environment of our ecology on the earth is not a meaningless complex of open systems, but it's an array of very meaningful features of the environment that we require in order to exist and function. Those are the affordances of our environment. And effectivities, the converse, the reciprocal, are behaviors that are utilized and to engaged in to utilize. Excuse me, I said that wrong. Physical. Okay, effectivities are behaviors that a living form exhibits that involve the utilization of and engagement with the affordances of the environment. That is, they're commensurate with the affordances. So, effectivities like eating and mating and locomotion match up with and align with various affordances in the environment. And one key set of affordances and affectivities, perhaps the critical set, involves other life forms and how we behave toward them, what we utilize in them, and what they afford to us. And um, a second key aspect of our ecology is the reciprocal processes of competition and cooperation, which both seem to exist in our ecology. And should note that competition is an either or logic of existence, whereas cooperation, collaboration is a both and logic of survival and evolution. Competition will generate selective elimination. Cooperation and collaboration generate integration. And we can find examples in the history of the evolution of life, say the merging of multicellular life forms during the Cambrian explosion into more symbiotic creatures as being a case of integration, and then the whittling down of different evolutionary trajectories through competition. But competition can sometimes lead to mutual amplification too in the predator-prey relationships. Howard Bloom proposes that the evolution of humanity is a product of war and reciprocity, which basically is similar to what I'm saying here. It's a product of competition elimination and cooperation mutual exchange. And this is basically the difference between zero-sum games, where if one side wins, the other side loses, versus non-zero sum games where both sides win. Integration, cooperation, collaboration, both and are cases of non-zero sum interactions. Zero sum is going to be where one side gets eliminated as a result of the other side winning. Okay, now there is the argument, and I'm not going to go into too much here because it's a whole talk in and of itself, whether we can develop integrated collective intelligence at a planetary or ecological level. Now, we clearly see consciousness in individual life forms. A proposal that's been made often is that maybe our whole ecology, perhaps integrated with technology, can realize some kind of planetary consciousness. But as I said, that's such a big topic, and I could say a lot about it, but I just wanted to mention it as of relevance to the issue of ecology. Now, I think that might be a good place to do a little pause here for 10 minutes. So, do we want to pause the recording, Terry? So, to return, the ecological evolutionary biology of life and consciousness. Now, here we get into the question of, well, what is life, the definition of it, and what is the connection between life and consciousness? And are there certain necessary physical conditions pertaining to living forms regarding consciousness? And I just want to mention that I have a really extensive discussion on the nature of life in my book, The Future of Science, Technology, and the Cosmos. And Eric Chasen, in his book, The Epic of Evolution, has a very complex and interesting discussion of life within the context of cosmic evolution as a stage in the evolution of the cosmos in his book, Epic of Evolution. Now, it's a long-standing puzzle regarding how life emerged, evolved from a non-living universe. But the fact of the matter is that life is continuous with non life, in that living creatures, at least on the earth, incorporate into their living bodies lots of different types of non living entities. That is, we contain within us lots of chemical components that are actually exist independent of it being alive. So the hierarchical complex evolution of life incorporates into it non-living entities, for at least on the earth, from the geology and makeup of the earth itself. So there is definitely some kind of significant jump, but at the same time there's a significant incorporation or assimilation into life of the non-living. Now, I just put up here to give us a sense of the question of what is life, um, a number of characteristic defining qualities that generally are proposed regarding the nature of life. Now, we're keeping in mind here throughout all of this is that how's life connected with consciousness? Number one, life is a multi-hierarchical complex organization, but it contains within it and relative to its outside a whole set of nested differentiations too. Going back to my previous point about the hierarchical organization both integrates and consists of differentiations and then relative to the surround. So life has to create boundaries between it and the outside to maintain its hierarchical internal structured pattern of forms. Life seems to always involve metabolism, which basically is going to relate back to the nature of open systems. It acquires and utilizes energy involving both anabolic and catabolic processes, that is, integration and breaking down. And these are features of open systems which require energy and material from the outside in order to maintain themselves. Metabolism is the process of utilizing energy and material from the outside to maintain itself. Life also seems to show the property of homeostasis, which is to regulate its internal conditions. But this relates back to an earlier point I made that conscious beings have to be able to be sensitive to their own internal states. But here we introduce also they have to be able to adjust those internal states. So this feeds into the whole notion of proprioception. Homeostasis is a key feature of living forms that is fundamental to the conscious process of proprioception, which is awareness of my body. But conversely, And actually, in some ways, it might seem like the opposite. Life is often characterized as manifesting growth and development. So life is not stable homeostasis. Life is also dynamic. That is, from birth to death, living forms show various kinds of patterns of growth and development. Another characteristic defining feature is sensitivity and responsiveness to the environment. This is a feature of open systems. They react to the environment, and it aligns with our perceptual consciousness in that we are conscious of the outside world or the environment surrounding us. So notice how these different processes which characterize life line up both with basic characteristics of open systems and basic features of consciousness. Life also seems to show reproduction, which is a combination of stability and change, in that reproduction involves replication from the parenting cell or organism. That's the element of stability, but it also involves mutation. And the mutational or change dimension is necessary for evolution in life. And life finally seems to show adaptation and evolution, that is, change over generations to better attune life to the environment. Now, this is a clear ecological feature of life, in that evolution is being defined as improved adaptation to the environment. And in fact, due to the fact that life is able to mutationally transform and develop itself and generating increased selective attunement to the environment, it constitutes an evolution in evolution. It's accelerating the process of cosmic evolution because we can get changes occurring through generations of reproductive offspring. And this, of course, is contrary or contradictory to the notion of static creationism, that life somehow was created the way it exists today. Rather, life has been an evolutionary process from the simplest forms of life, which built upon and incorporated into them non-living entities and chemicals, and then through reproduction and mutation was able to speed up the very process of evolution across genetic lines. Now, you can come up with some more summary definitions of life, and here's three that seem to be representative of what people have suggested about life. Life is a self-sustaining chemical system, an open system, capable of Darwinian evolution. Now, that's a synthesis of the concepts of stability and change. Life is an integrated system, which I brought up already, able to sustain itself, to grow and evolve in an environment, and this is in distinction from the non-living. So that one involves the homeostatic process, the developmental process, and the evolutionary process as key features of integrated dynamic open systems that are alive. And the third one is actually from the autopoietics, and I always have trouble pronouncing it, autopoiesis, or autopoiesis theory of life, that life creates and maintains its own differentiated entity, negative entropy, and I talked about that just previously, in contrast to the general flow of entropy. So this basically is bringing up the idea that life is a self-creating, self-maintaining differentiation relative to an environment that is perpetually falling apart. But life, on the other hand, is moving in the opposite direction, negative entropy. Now, in a very interesting article that came out recently, that simply had to do with the question of can AI be conscious? The neurophysiologist Seth argued that only living things can be conscious, and that consciousness emerges from being alive. That is, in a literal sense, consciousness is the sense of being alive. And what Seth proposes is basically the autopoiesis theory of life. And I put up here the link to the article that's up online, The Mythology of Conscious AI. But regardless of whether, how you come down on the question of conscious AI, the argument here is that only living things can be conscious. And it's got something to do with what's being described above there regarding the nature of life. And what I would suggest to you is that these different definitions of life revolve around the idea that life is a form of directed, active engagement with the environment to perpetuate, literally to create and maintain and to further evolve its own existence. So a system must purposefully engage with the environment if a condition of consciousness is to be alive in order to be conscious. And so the implication would be that consciousness, which arises out of life, is not an effect of matter, but an engagement with physical reality. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that matter doesn't cause consciousness? Rather, consciousness is a means by which matter or physical reality is engaged. And it's engaged in the sense of it is a directive, active engagement with the environment to perpetuate its own existence. And it's self-maintaining. So that could be seen as a fundamental feature of life, which carries over into the very nature of consciousness. If we look at consciousness as, if we look at life as being a necessary condition of consciousness. Now, if we look at our biological makeup, we need to keep in mind, of course, this biological makeup is nested inside of an ecological reality. So the question is going to be, what is the role of the brain, the nervous system, the biological body in consciousness, and the connection of biological structures to ecological conditions, which I just reviewed? And as I said, it's nested holistic systems in that the brain is embedded and evolved within the nervous system, which evolved concurrently with it. This system is embedded and evolved within the body, which was an evolutionary reality. And the body, or biological bodies, are embedded and evolved within an evolutionary environment of the earth. That is, we have distinctive wholes, differentiated wholes within bigger encompassing wholes. But these are also a nesting of fields of differentiation. And to go back to the notion of metabolism, our physical body, our biological body, is connected with the process of creating and maintaining our differentiations as an open system, drawing energy and material from the surround. So our brain, nervous system, biological body is a complex hierarchical structure of differentiations that are nested in a surrounding ecology of affordances that are needed and utilized through metabolism for that nested, distinctive, complex biological system to maintain and evolve itself. Now, the body as a whole actually consists of a set of relatively distinct localized systems that perform relatively distinctive functions. But for example, it is through the respiratory system that we engage, and that includes our lungs. We engage in the incorporation of oxygen and the outflow of carbon dioxide. Our circulatory system is involved in the distribution of oxygenated blood and the uptake of deoxygenated carbon dioxide laden blood. That is, each of the systems performs some distinctive function and is relatively localized in the entire biological body. But the thing to keep in mind here is that these systems require each other for operation. So even though they're distinct in terms of their functioning, relatively distinct, and even though they have relatively localized parts of the body in which they are set, they all require each other in order for the whole to work. So they're all active and interactive with each other. When we come to the nervous system, as one system embedded in that biological body, there's a basic distinction that's made between the central nervous system, which is the brain and the attached spinal cord running down the center from the top of the body, and the peripheral nervous system, which is a branching fractile structure of nerves and smaller nerve fibers that spread out through the entire rest of the body. The peripheral nervous system is generally divided between the somatic voluntary side and the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system is divided into the sympathetic, involved in arousal, and the parasympathetic, involved in rest. And each of these subdivisions, though, keep in mind, they're all integrated back in through the central nervous system, but the central nervous system does not exist in isolation from the peripheral nervous system. There's a convergent divergent relationship between these two subsystems in that the pathways from the peripheral combine together and funnel up into the center, or conversely, the pathways out of the center spread out and divide out into the body. The nervous system is connected on the surface with sense organs via sensory nerves and connected with the muscles via motor nerves. And the sensory system and the motor system and the central nervous system are all active during perception, proprioception, and behavior. Now, if that wasn't complicated enough, we have a second communicative system, the endocrine system, which generates diffuse changes in hormones throughout the system, which impacts the entire system, including the central nervous system. In fact, it interacts with the central nervous system through the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. So we have this mutual feedback effect between the nervous system and the endocrine system, the latter being primarily a diffuse chemical system, which definitely impacts what's going on in the nervous system and therefore in the entire body. And you could further subdivide the central nervous system into smaller systems. Uh, and we have the cortex, the thalamus, the medulla oblongata. I won't go into it in any detail, but there's very detailed anatomical divisions that have been identified in our central nervous system, and in particular, our brain. Now, the question has come up, and this is the title of this on top here, is Does the brain work as an integrated whole, or do the subsystems in the brain have distinctive functions? Now, the thing to keep in mind is that this has been a hot debated issue throughout the history of brain research, physiological psychology, and in fact, it's a pseudo issue, it's a false issue, because although each subsystem in the nervous system may perform relatively distinctive functions, like the amygdala seems to be distinctively involved in emotion, the frontal cortex seems to be distinctively involved in planning, the occipital lobes in vision. These subsystems of the nervous system only operate in interaction with each other, that is, holistically. So, although we have this exceedingly differentiated set of structures with relatively distinctive conscious psychological functions, the whole thing operates as an integrative, interactive whole, as opposed to a lot of separate individual parts. And we're going to compare this to something that's come up already with the way the cosmos is organized as complementary differentiation integrations, and how consciousness is organized in terms of differentiation and integration. And in case your philosophical, metaphysical mind were at work now, this continual coupling of this dual dimension of reality, notice, is the Taoist yin yang, the togetherness and the integration and the differentiation and separation, keeping in mind that the two things are occur together in existence and not separate. Now, you could even further subdivide the nervous system down into individual neurons, cells, which form vast networks of interconnected um, activity among themselves through input and output via electrochemical activity. And um, neurons can both excite and inhibit each other, but neurons are all continuously active with characteristic pulsatory, oscillatory beatings of so many impulses per unit of time. It is a highly misleading notion that we use only part of our brain, or that parts of our brain become inactive at different times. Our brains, that is, all of the individual neurons, are all beating away at their own little rhythms, which change over time, but are always in a state of electrochemical pulsatory activity. They're dynamic, they are independently delineated, they have cell bodies and surfaces, but they are immensely interconnected with each other, thus having both this dimension of integration and differentiation among the multi-billion and multi-trillion, multi-billion cells and multi-trillion synaptic connections between them. So this connects back again to the complementary reciprocal processes of differentiation and integration. And so we could describe our biological bodies as highly complex, integrated differentiations. And in the case of the nervous system in the body, there is this convergent integrated differentiations that focus into the nervous system itself as the coordinator of the body in many different respects. Now, I think I already, yeah, one thing I should just mention about what I was saying just now about integration and differentiation. I think that Integrated information theory, which I discussed under theories of consciousness, is clearly onto something when it argues that the necessary brain neurological conditions of consciousness must manifest a high level of interactive, integrative, differentiated states. That is, consciousness is a complexly differentiated but integrated phenomenological reality. And underneath that must be some kind of structure or structures involving an immense number of differentiated but interactive parts of, in their case, they think the brain. But I would push it a little further than that and not just simply say the brain. Now, the question has come up about the biological location of consciousness. And although the argument could be made that the biological location of consciousness lies in the central nervous system, and in particular the brain, because there's an immense amount of study showing that stimulation or damage of localized brain states are associated with changes in consciousness. The thing to keep in mind is that all of that experimental data is being reported by living, breathing, holistic, personified conscious beings. That is, when someone pokes the brain with an electrode, in order to ascertain the conscious effect is reported by a person who has that brain lying on the table. That is, we don't have at this point in time an experimental setup where we could take a brain out of the body. This has been done in science fiction, of course. Technologically keep it alive, hook up transmission lines, and then ask that disembodied brain when we poke it, is it having any consciousness? And if indeed, what is it the consciousness of? So if we took a brain out of a body and poked its occipital lobes, would we get a report from that disembodied brain that it was having visual sensations? At this point in time, all of the reports come from people possessing those brains, reporting what they're experiencing. And I think I know I suggested already that consciousness is phenomenologically not experienced as localized in the head, but is experienced as distributed throughout the entire body or most of it. So my hands feel conscious, my feet feel conscious, my legs feel conscious. Consciousness does not seem to be simply localized up toward my head, although it does feel as if when I'm thinking, that mode of consciousness, thinking consciousness, is around my head. Okay, now the question is, can a single life form or a plant possess consciousness without a nervous system? The question would simply be, does it possess a sufficiently differentiated and integrative dimension in its own anatomy and physiology? Because I think the IIT theory is onto something, that there has to be a sufficient level of integration of complex differentiations to get consciousness in a physical body. That doesn't preclude plants or single cell life forms. Now I'm going to give you two different theories of the way the nervous system works to delve into this question of consciousness in the nervous system some more. The standard view, which is presented in almost all textbooks, is that the central nervous system is connected with the sensory perceptual sense organs or systems and the muscular systems, and that the brain has channeled into it convergent pathways of activity that come from the sensory nervous systems running inward into the brain, providing input to the brain from what's occurring in the sense organs. And a second set of pathways, which correspond to output or pathways of involving electrical activity that diverge out through the motor nerves from the brain into the muscles. And the brain sits at the center where it both receives, processes, integrates the input coming into it from the sensory systems and the sense organs and initiates and coordinates output that runs out from the brain to the muscles. And what the brain possesses is a received representation of the world that comes in through the senses and the sensory pathways, and that behavior is an initiated reaction that takes place in the brain to those internal representations and runs out. So consciousness is viewed as arising in the brain, which is conceptualized as a way station between input and output. And it receives and interprets input as conscious representations and initiates behavioral output. And this lines up with the cognitive theory of consciousness. Now, what I would suggest is that even though this model is presented in almost all psychology, neurophysiology textbooks on the surface, it is simplistic and misleading. And what it does is it ends up implying that the brain and consciousness is separated away like a little man in the head who's getting input from the outside and sending directives out through the muscles to the outside. But the brain and consciousness up here in the middle is separated away and is doing all of the psychological processing in and of itself and is just simply receiving, processing, and then initiating action out. Now, a second way to look at that arrangement is that it isn't incoming pathways going from the outside to the inside and outgoing pathways going from the inside to the outside, but rather it's loops. And what I mean by that is that the input that comes in through sense organs is actively modified by output coming down from the brain all along the sensory pathways. So this is not a one-way channel from sense organ to brain, but rather it's a continual process of inflow being modified by outflow as it moves along from outside to inside. In fact, some people suggest that the brain actually is anticipating on a continual basis what's coming in and is guiding perception based upon its anticipations and predictions about what's coming in. So the brain is not sitting there receiving messages. The brain is actually, in a sense, anticipating and guiding and directing what's coming in. So it's a form of engagement with the outside as a form of reception from the outside. The reverse, the output, is actually modified all along the way going down by input coming in all the way going down. So again, we get loops. So it's not like a command starts up in the middle and then runs down and moves the muscles, but rather what happens up here as we go down through from brain to muscles is continually being modified by different ganglionic networks along the way down into the fingers and the feet and the body. So the output is not simply output, but it's modulated output, just like the input is not simply input, it's modulated input. So there's no reception and command process here. Rather, there is this active, modulated interface with the outside and this active, modulated output from the outside. And these are nested loops. So the nested loops in our neurophysiology are supportive of the perception, proprioception, behavioral loop in consciousness, where what we sense is tied into and utilized for how we behave, and how we behave influences what we sense, and that bigger, that is embedded in a bigger loop of the body as a whole interacting with the environment as a whole. So the environment doesn't simply cause passive reactions in the body changes environmental impact in the environment itself. So the brain, the nervous system, the body is not a passive receiver and reactor. Rather, it's a engaging mechanism that's built up out of interactive loops within loops, and this is the neurobiological physical conditions of consciousness as a form of engagement with the world as opposed to a reaction up there in the brain. Now I'm going to go over just a little bit here, but I'm almost done. Okay. I already mentioned about, the assumption that the brain is the source of consciousness and that uh, the brain integrates together consciousness, and that's based on lots of studies, but they always take place with conscious beings. And even if it turned out that the brain was connected with consciousness in this way of a causative relationship, it doesn't solve the heart problem. And it creates two very deep philosophical issues, and there's other ones that I'm not going to mention right now, is that if it were true that the brain caused consciousness, then the postulated physical brain and the world out there that presumably is connected with causes and consciousness is unobservable. And in fact, one's own body, which seems to be very observable to us because it's unobservable too, which gets us into the whole Descartes matrix problem. Are we experiencing a simulation? This model, the input output model, makes the idea that we're experiencing a simulation possible. But if the brain, nervous system, body as a whole is engaging the world as its mechanism of realizing consciousness, then the matrix problem disappears. We're not experiencing a simulation. We're not lying on a lab someplace having our brain stimulated. Now, there's more I could say on that, but um, I'm running. I ran out of time anyway. Okay. What I would suggest to you is that when we take all this into account, consciousness, understood from a physical point of view, is an ecological event. It's not something simply in our brain, nor even simply, in a sense, in our bodies. Consciousness is a relation created by an engaging life form with an environment. That is, it's ecological. It's not localized in the brain. It's grounded in an active, engaging, selective resonance of the brain with the environment. So consciousness is not something intrinsic. Rather, it's relational. So when I'm conscious, I'm engaged in a relational engagement with reality. And that relational engagement is supported by active engaging loops, nested loops of activity. And the brain is integral to those, but consciousness is a relational reality at the sensing, doing, feeling, desiring levels. We sense the world, we act on the world, we feel the world, we desire the world. And all of those are active engagements, relational engagements set up. It's anchored here, but it's outer directed. It's the body as a whole rather than the brain. If it's private, it's because it's localized, relatively localized in the body. So consciousness is an emergent relational property of an evolving universe. It's not primordial. It involves the complementary processes of integration and differentiation that line up with the holistic and differentiating structure of the biological body within a holistic differentiated structure of an ecology. And it's also selective and it's purposeful and directive. No, I went over already and I didn't even get to conscious AI. Excuse me. But let me take 5 minutes. We have an ongoing history in science fiction of speculations about intelligent conscious machines. And there's stories about the creation of those machines and the idea that even conscious AI is some kind of evolutionary asymptote of the universe. And arguments for conscious machines have been defended on various bases, one of which is computational functionalism, which comes out of Kurzweil and other people who support this idea of conscious AI, that consciousness in the mind is simply information content and information processing, which can take place in different kinds of substrates aside from living creatures. Seth's critique is that only living things could be conscious because there's various things about living things, including metabolism, that machines do not possess. And there's Searle's classic Chinese tea room that computers and AI simply mimic consciousness but don't actually generate it. But my argument back a long time ago is you can't say that AI can't be conscious if we don't know what the physical conditions of consciousness are to begin with. Now, I tried to lay out a whole bunch of them, and therefore, based on the physical conditions that I laid out, I would say that here's reasons to think that AI in its present form, robots or computers, can't be conscious. That doesn't mean we can't redesign them in a different way. But first, AI doesn't actively engage the environment. It gets input from the outside and reacts to it, but it doesn't move about and actively engage the environment with purpose and intention. AI doesn't show self creation, self maintenance, growth, or evolution. Living creatures do. Now, you can start throwing some counter arguments to that, but on the surface, it doesn't look like the computer puts itself together, maintains itself if it happens to break, grows itself, or evolves itself. AI doesn't seem to evince feeling or desire, which are two fundamental features of consciousness in living beings and in humans. Now, we can devise robotic systems that evince on the surface different facial expressions that clearly look like different emotions, but the question is whether those emotions are being felt or not. And AI doesn't engage in purposeful evolution of itself or the environment, which conscious humans do. So we actually purposefully attempt to facilitate the ongoing evolution of ourselves and the environment, which includes AIs. So right now, It's us who are purposefully evolving AIs. AIs are not purposefully evolving themselves. Now, we can get some debate on that one too. But I would say that humans, because we are cyborgs, which are functional syntheses of our biopsychosocial nature and our technology, can realize and are created by purposeful consciousness, can realize holistic consciousness as a cyborg reality. Um, a little puzzle I'll leave with you on this one. Why is it that when you pick up a pencil or a pen and you write on the surface of a object, it feels as if you are able to sense the surface of the object through the point of the pen? It's as if the point of the pen or the pencil has become part of your sensing body. So can we conceive of cyborgs as a combination of biological, neurological, and technological parts, itself being holistically conscious? But I'll still go ahead and say there is something to be said for the idea from Arthur C. Clarke that at present our robots and AI are highly dependent on us, but in fact are our evolutionary children. So maybe in the future, as our own reproductive process going on here technologically, they will inherit reality from us because we're going to build the next level in our own and life's own evolutionary development, which is what AIs are. Okay, so just in closing, I presented a number of proposals on the physical conditions of consciousness existing in an evolutionary universe that are necessary for consciousness. I assume that consciousness emerged and evolved rather than being primordial. And there are key evolutionary physical factors that go into consciousness. These physical factors go beyond simply the biological and neurological, but include the ecological and the cosmological. I am not a materialist. I think that these physical conditions are necessary rather than sufficient for the emergence of consciousness. But we still got to come back to this reciprocity. The reciprocity being that even though it looks, and I've spent a lot of time with it, that there are certain physical conditions and factors that go into the evolution and support of consciousness. All of that physical reality that I just described, or you may describe, is revealed and understood through the medium of consciousness. So we end up in this loop. So this requires continued inquiry into the future, which is what I'm doing in the next chapters in the book. Anyway, that ends today. Thank you for listening to me for 2 hours, and I will stop sharing. I will be here if anybody wants to, uh, if I want to talk about the questions, any new questions.